dawn breaks slowly over Boston in the 1760s, not with peace but with tension. A pale grey light creeps over the harbor, cutting through the cold Atlantic wind. The water slaps softly against wooden docks as ships sit idle, their masts standing like watchful sentinels. The air smells of salt, smoke, and damped timber. Church bells begin to toll, not in celebration, but in routine, marking another day in a city that hasn't truly slept in years. Boston wakes early because it has learned to stay alert. The streets are narrow, uneven, and crowded. Boots scrape against frozen dirt. Wagon wheels groan. Merchants lift their shutters while glancing over their shoulders. Housewives pull shawls tighter as they step outside, careful not to linger. Words are spoken quietly now. Trust is rare. Then the sound changes. A steady rhythm of marching boots echoes between the buildings. British soldiers' red coats, sharp against the muted browns and greys of the town, move through the streets in formation. Muskets rest against their shoulders. Bayonets catch the morning light. They are not visitors. They live here. They lodge in homes, occupy public buildings, and patrol neighborhoods where resentment simmers just beneath the surface. Some townspeople stare openly, fists clenched. Others look away, jaw tight, swallowing anger. Children pause mid-step to watch the soldiers pass. They don't yet understand politics or taxes, but they understand fear, and they understand occupation. The narrator asks quietly, deliberately, what does rebellion look like before it begins? It doesn't look like gunfire. It doesn't look like declarations. It looks like this. A harbor that feeds an empire that strangles a city. Soon, its dark waters will swallow crates of tea in an act that shocks the world, the Boston Tea Party. But for now, the ships remain, heavy with control and consequence. A brick building stands tall at the heart of town, the old State House. From its balcony, royal authority speaks down to the people. Below it, crowds gather, voices rising, patience thinning. Not long from now, bullets will fly nearby, and history will remember it as a massacre. But this morning, the square is quiet. Too quiet. And everywhere there is the feeling of being watched. Boston is a city living under occupation. Taxes without representation. Laws written an ocean away. Soldiers enforcing order with loaded muskets. No one knows exactly when violence will come, but everyone knows it will. This is the moment before the spark. The breath held before the explosion. The calm that isn't calm at all. Because before the first shot of the American Revolution, there was Boston. To understand the American Revolution, we must first understand Boston not as a symbol, but as a place. A real city, loud, crowded, uneasy. Long before it became a legend, Boston was a British colonial town, clinging to the edge of the Atlantic, trying to breathe under the weight of an empire. In the 1760s, Boston was home to roughly 15,000 people. By modern standards, it was small. By colonial standards, it was powerful. Its streets twisted tightly around the harbor, packed with merchants, sailors, laborers, artisans, and families who depended on the sea for survival. Nearly everything in Boston flowed through its docks: food, news, money, and ideas. Boston was not just another colony. It was New England's economic heart. Ships arrived daily carrying goods from Britain and beyond. Fish, timber, and rum left Boston's ports, feeding global trade routes. Wealth concentrated here. So did influence. Printers produced newspapers and pamphlets read across the colonies. Merchants funded resistance. Preachers shaped opinion from their pulpits. When Boston spoke, other colonies listened. That is precisely why Britain watched it so closely. Boston mattered more than most colonial cities because it was loud, organized, and increasingly defiant. While other towns grumbled quietly, Boston argued publicly. It questioned authority, it protested, and it refused to back down. British control tightened in response. Taxes were imposed, not just to raise money, but to assert dominance. Duties on paper, paint, glass, and tea reminded colonists who held power. Trade restrictions limited who Bostonians could buy from and sell to, cutting directly into livelihoods. Smuggling flourished, not only out of greed, but out of necessity. And when resistance grew too bold, Britain sent soldiers. Redcoats marched through Boston streets, muskets loaded, bayonets fixed. They guarded customs houses. They enforced laws. They lived among civilians, sharing taverns, competing for work, and inflaming already fragile tensions. Boston was no longer simply governed, it was occupied. Everyday life changed. Arguments broke out in marketplaces. Whispers filled taverns. Fear sat beside anger at dinner tables. Ordinary people, dockworkers, shopkeepers, widows, apprentices, found themselves trapped between survival and submission. The question was no longer if something would break, but when. Boston became a pressure chamber. The city was British in name, but increasingly American in spirit. Loyalty to the crown faded with every tax collected, every ship inspected, every soldier stationed on a corner. What made Boston dangerous wasn't just its anger, it was its unity. Resistance here was shared, discussed, printed, and remembered. This was not yet a revolution, but it was no longer peace. And so, to understand how 13 colonies moved toward independence, we cannot begin with gunfire or declarations. We must begin higher among the docks, the streets, the churches, and the crowded rooms where frustration hardened into resolve. To understand the revolution, we must walk the city as it was. To walk the streets of Boston in the decades before the American Revolution was to walk through a city that never truly rested. Life unfolded outdoors, shoulder to shoulder, in spaces so tight that privacy barely existed. Then that closeness would change history. Boston's roads were not paved. They were narrow dirt paths, uneven and muddy, shaped more by habit than planning. In summer, dust hung in the air, kicked up by boots, carts, and hooves. In winter, the same streets turned slick and treacherous, frozen ruts catching wagon wheels and sending pedestrians stumbling. These roads twisted unpredictably, bending around hills, houses, and the shoreline, giving Boston its cramped, maze-like feel. Homes pressed close together, many built of wood, stacked tightly as if for warmth. Some leaned with age, others showed scars from past fires, blackened beams, patched walls. Brick buildings existed, but they were fewer, owned mostly by the wealthy or by institutions. Chimneys smoked constantly, filling the air with the scent of burning coal and wood. Open hearths were necessary, but dangerous. Fire was a constant threat, capable of racing through entire neighborhoods in hours. The city smelled alive and unpleasant. Salt from the harbor mixed with fish guts, animal waste, and human refuse. There was no modern sanitation. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets. Livestock wandered freely. Markets overflowed with produce, meat, and noise, but also rot and flies. Boston was loud, vendors shouting prices, blacksmiths hammering iron, sailors arguing, children crying, bells ringing. Silence was rare, and when it came, it felt unnatural. Yet this chaos was normal. Daily life revolved around work, and work revolved around class. Boston's social divisions were visible everywhere, often within the same street. Merchants lived in sturdier homes closer to the center of town, near counting houses, warehouses, and docks. Their clothes were cleaner, their shoes intact. They spoke of shipping schedules, credit, and trade routes. They read newspapers and pamphlets, debated politics, and had time to think beyond survival. Just steps away lived dockworkers, laborers, apprentices, and sailors. Their homes were smaller, colder, and more crowded. Families shared single rooms. Children worked early. Food was simple and sometimes scarce. These men and women depended on the harbor for wages, unloading ships, hauling goods, repairing hulls. When trade slowed or when British regulations tightened, their lives became instantly harder. This imbalance fueled resentment. Merchants complained about taxes and lost profits. Dockworkers felt hunger. Both blamed British policy, but for different reasons. What made Boston dangerous was not just inequality, it was how close everyone lived to one another. A wealthy merchant and a struggling sailor might drink in the same tavern. An apprentice might overhear political arguments meant for elites. Ideas did not stay contained. They traveled. Crowded marketplaces became informal information hubs. News from London, rumors of new taxes, whispers of resistance, were passed mouth to mouth. Printers sold pamphlets arguing against British authority. Someone would read aloud to those who couldn't read, turning private texts into public debates. Discontent spread not because people were organized, but because they were close. Proximity erased distance between thought and action. Churches reinforced this effect. Sermons were not only religious, they were political, filled with language about liberty, duty, and moral resistance. Taverns extended those conversations late into the night, where anger sharpened over ale and frustration found a voice. Arguments broke out. Alliances formed. Names were remembered. Boston's streets became classrooms. Children learned early what side their families were on. They watched soldiers march past their homes. They heard curses muttered under breath. They saw arguments escalate into shoves. The presence of British troops intensified everything. Redcoats walked the same streets, drank in the same taverns, and competed for the same jobs. Their uniforms made them visible symbols of power and targets of resentment. Living conditions left no room for indifference. When a new tax was announced, everyone felt it. When a ship was seized, the docks went quiet. When a soldier struck a civilian, the story spread within hours. In a city this tight, events did not fade, they echoed, the streets remembered. What might have remained isolated anger elsewhere became shared outrage in Boston. Its geography tight, crowded, unavoidable turned frustration into collective identity. People did not have to seek resistance. They stumbled into it on their way to work, at the market, in church pews, and outside their own doors. This was not yet rebellion in the open, but it was preparation. The streets of colonial Boston trained its people daily, relentlessly, to live with tension, to talk politics, to choose sides. Long before muskets fired, the city itself was shaping revolution, one crowded street at a time. If the streets of colonial Boston were its nerves, then Boston Harbor was its heart. Everything that mattered flowed through this stretch of dark, restless water. Food, fuel, money, news, and power arrived and departed by ship. The harbor fed the city, employed its people, and connected Boston to the wider Atlantic world. Without it, Boston did not simply struggle, it suffocated. From dawn to dusk, the docks were alive. Sailors shouted orders, ropes creaked under strain, barrels rolled across planks slick with salt water. Fish, timber, rum, and furs were unloaded, inspected, taxed, and stored. Every crate represented income for someone and dependence on someone else. For merchants, the harbor meant profit. For dockworkers, it meant survival. And for Britain, it meant leverage. The British Empire understood that controlling Boston meant controlling its harbor. Ships entering and leaving were subject to regulation, inspection, and taxation. Laws passed in London dictated who Bostonians could trade with, what they could import, and how much they had to pay for the privilege. Customs officials monitored cargo. Paperwork multiplied, delays increased, costs rose. To the Empire, these were administrative measures. To Boston, they were suffocating restraints. Merchants saw their profits shrink as duties piled up. Dockworkers felt the effects immediately. Fewer ships meant fewer jobs. Families dependent on daily wages felt hunger long before politicians felt pressure. Every new regulation rippled outward from the docks into homes, taverns, and markets. Resentment grew with every tide. Smuggling became Boston's quiet rebellion. Ships unloaded goods under cover of darkness. Cargo disappeared before inspectors arrived. Entire communities looked the other way, not because they were criminals, but because the system left them no choice. Smuggling wasn't just about money. It was about dignity. It was about refusing to be choked by distant authority. British officials responded by tightening control. More inspections, more seizures, more soldiers. Warships anchored in the harbor, their cannons pointed toward the town, a constant, unspoken threat. Customs officers gained power, backed by armed force. When ships were confiscated, livelihoods vanished overnight. Each seizure felt less like law enforcement and more like punishment. Boston's anger no longer simmered, it boiled. The harbor became a stage for confrontation. Crowds gathered to watch inspections. Arguments erupted on the docks. Pamphlets circulated accusing Britain of economic tyranny. What had once been a place of opportunity now felt like a cage, visible, guarded, and inescapable. Then came tea. Tea was more than a drink. It was routine, comfort, and culture. Britain's attempt to enforce a monopoly on its sale struck at both wallets and pride. Cheap tea still carried a message: submission. Buying it meant accepting Parliament's right to tax without consent. Boston refused. What followed was not chaos but calculation. A cold December night. Quiet streets. Ships heavy with cargo resting in the harbor's black water. Disguised men moved with purpose, not rage. Crates were opened. Tea was lifted, then dropped splash after splash until the harbor itself carried the protest. History would name it the Boston Tea Party. The water absorbed millions of dollars worth of tea. But the message was priceless. Boston would not comply quietly. Britain's response was swift and devastating. The harbor was closed. No ships in, no ships out. For a city dependent on maritime trade, this was economic strangulation. Dockworkers lost jobs instantly. Merchants faced ruin. Supplies dwindled. Prices rose. Families who had never dumped tea into the water now paid the price for defiance. The punishment was collective, designed to break the city's will. Instead, it hardened it. The harbor sat eerily still. Piers once loud with labor fell silent. Ships rotted at anchor. Hunger spread, but so did solidarity. Other colonies sent aid. Sympathy replaced isolation. What Britain intended as a warning became a rallying cry. Boston learned a brutal lesson. Power flowed through the harbor and so did resistance. By closing it, Britain revealed the truth it hoped to hide. Control of trade was control of life itself, and a people who could be starved into obedience were never truly free. The harbor had once made Boston wealthy. Now it made Boston dangerous. Every wave against the docks carried the same message. Authority could block trade, but it could not drown resolve. Control the harbor, and you might control the people, but only until the people decide the harbor no longer belongs to you. And Boston had decided. At the center of colonial Boston stood a building that embodied everything the city was beginning to reject. The old State House rose above the surrounding streets, solid and imposing, its brick walls and tall windows designed to command attention. It was not the largest structure in Boston, but it was the most symbolic. From here, royal authority spoke. From here, laws were announced, taxes enforced, and power displayed, quite literally from above. Inside its chambers, British-appointed officials debated policy and enforced orders sent across the Atlantic. They spoke in measured tones, surrounded by polished wood, ledgers, and guards. Their world was elevated, structured, and insulated. Outside those walls, Boston felt very different. Below the balcony, the people gathered. Merchants, dockworkers, apprentices, widows, sailors. Boston's entire social spectrum converged in the streets around the old State House. It was the city's natural meeting point, where news traveled fast and crowds formed instinctively. When proclamations were read aloud from above, the people listened from below, necks craned upward, faces tight with frustration. The physical divide mattered. British officials stood elevated, literally above the crowd, while ordinary Bostonians stood packed tightly together at street level. This wasn't accidental architecture. It reinforced hierarchy. Authority spoke downward. Obedience was expected upward. But Boston was no longer obedient. As taxes multiplied and soldiers filled the streets, the square around the old State House transformed into a space of resistance. Protests grew louder. Voices overlapped. Insults flew upward, toward the balcony. What had once been murmurs became chants. Anger lost its fear of being heard. British soldiers were stationed nearby to keep order. Their presence changed the mood instantly. Muskets rested in hands, meant to intimidate. Bayonets gleamed as warnings. The crowd knew these men were not there to listen, they were there to enforce. Tension thickened the air. Arguments broke out daily. Soldiers and civilians traded insults. Snowballs flew. Stones followed. Each encounter chipped away at restraint. Everyone sensed the same truth. Control was slipping, and force was becoming the only language left. Then came the night that shattered illusion. In March 1770, as evening settled over King Street near the old State House, a confrontation escalated beyond control. What began as verbal harassment turned physical. Crowds pressed closer. Soldiers tightened ranks. Confusion blurred intent. Orders were shouted or misheard. A gun fired, then another. Smoke filled the cold night air. When it cleared, civilians lay wounded and dying in the street. Blood stained the snow. Silence fell, not the calm kind, but the stunned, horrified stillness that follows irreversible change. History would name it the Boston Massacre. Fear swept the city immediately. Parents pulled children indoors. Taverns fell quiet. Church bells rang not for prayer, but for alarm. Boston realized something profound had happened. This was no longer harassment, no longer occupation alone. This was violence sanctioned by authority. Rage followed fear quickly. Funerals became demonstrations. Thousands marched behind coffins through the streets, a city mourning and accusing together. Word spread beyond Boston, carried by pamphlets and engravings that framed the event not as chaos, but as murder. Public opinion shifted decisively. Some who had once tried to remain neutral could no longer justify silence. Even those wary of rebellion saw the danger of unchecked power enforced by soldiers. Trust in British authority collapsed, it because of ideology, but because of blood. The old State House now meant something new. It was no longer just a seat of government. It became a symbol of imbalanced power above, people below, violence in between. Every time Bostonians passed it, they remembered what happened nearby. The building didn't need to speak anymore. Its presence was accusation enough. British officials attempted damage control. Trials were held. Order was restored on paper. But emotionally, the city had crossed a line. Fear lingered, but it no longer paralyzed. It sharpened. Boston understood that protest carried risk, but obedience carried danger. The massacre hardened resolve. It taught a painful lesson. Rights could not be safely argued beneath loaded muskets. Authority that relied on force had forfeited moral ground. From that point forward, resistance gained legitimacy in the minds of ordinary people. Standing at the old State House after 1770, one could feel it, the air heavier, the crowd quieter but more focused. The distance between ruler and ruled no longer merely physical. Power still spoke from above, but belief had shifted below. And once belief changes, buildings cannot hold back history. In colonial Boston, revolution did not begin in grand halls or royal courts. It took shape in places meant for gathering, worship, and conversation spaces where ordinary people met, listened, argued, and decided. Taverns and churches became the city's unofficial nerve centers, transforming daily routines into quiet acts of resistance. Taverns were everywhere in Boston. They were warm, loud, and familiar places to drink, eat, and escape the pressure of the streets. But beneath the clatter of mugs and laughter, something more serious was happening. Taverns became political headquarters, not by design, but by necessity. Here, merchants sat beside dockworkers. Apprentices listened while elders spoke. News traveled fast, carried by sailors arriving from distant ports and merchants returning from other colonies. Conversations turned from prices and weather to taxes and laws. Complaints sharpened into arguments. Arguments hardened into plans. The beauty of taverns was their informality. No invitations were required. No records kept. A man could enter as a customer and leave as a conspirator. Ideas flowed as freely as ale, and in a city as crowded as Boston, a rumor overheard in the morning could become a shared belief by nightfall. British officials underestimated these spaces. They saw taverns as places of disorder, not organization. But that disorder was precisely their strength. Authority had no single door to close, no leader to arrest that would silence the room. Resistance was social before it was political. While taverns stirred debate, churches spread information. Boston's churches were among the few places where large groups gathered regularly, without suspicion. Sermons reached men, women, and children alike. Ministers spoke carefully, but their words carried weight. Scripture blended with commentary on liberty, morality, and the limits of obedience. Tyranny was framed not just as political overreach, but as moral failure. Congregations listened and remembered. After services, people talked. Messages passed quietly from pew to pew. Warnings about troop movements, news of new laws, reactions to events at the harbor or the old State House. Churches became information networks, trusted because they were familiar and respected. What was said there felt legitimate, sanctioned by faith and community. Together, taverns and churches formed a communication web that British authorities struggled to penetrate. Pamphlets amplified everything. Boston was a city of printers. Small presses churned out short, sharp texts that challenged British authority and explained colonial grievances in plain language. Pamphlets were cheap, portable, and powerful. They could be read aloud to crowds or passed hand to hand. They crossed class lines, turning complex political ideas into shared understanding. Speeches followed the same path. Delivered in taverns, meeting houses, and public squares, they stirred emotion more than intellect. Speakers learned to frame resistance as common sense, defending livelihoods, families, and dignity. The revolution was not presented as radical change, but as necessary protection. From these conversations emerged organization. One group, in particular, gave shape to Boston's resistance, the Sons of Liberty. They were not a formal army or government, but a network of merchants, artisans, printers, and laborers bound by shared purpose. They organized protests, coordinated boycotts, and ensured that British actions never went unanswered. Their meetings were quiet. Plans were made over meals and drinks, disguised as ordinary social gatherings. There were no uniforms, no headquarters marked on a map. The strength of the group lay in its invisibility and its reach. Anyone could belong. Everyone could contribute. At the center of this web stood a man who understood the power of words and patience. Samuel Adams. Adams was not the loudest voice in the room, but he was the most persistent. He attended meetings others avoided. He wrote relentlessly. He understood that anger alone was dangerous, but organized anger could reshape a nation. Adams helped turn scattered frustration into sustained resistance, guiding public opinion without demanding attention for himself. He knew revolutions failed when they moved too fast or revealed themselves too soon. So the work continued quietly, tavern by tavern, church by church, pamphlet by pamphlet. Boston became a city where people expected politics to be part of daily life. Discussion was constant. Awareness was shared. Neutrality became harder to maintain. British authority remained visible in uniforms and buildings. Resistance lived in conversations. What made this phase of the revolution so powerful was its ordinariness. No dramatic declarations, no single moment of rebellion, just repeated acts of listening, speaking, and remembering. The groundwork was laid patiently, deliberately, by people who understood that change required more than anger, it required unity. By the time violence erupted openly, Boston was already prepared. The revolution did not need to be announced. It had already been rehearsed, planned at tables where mugs were raised, shared in pews where heads bowed, printed on pages meant to be folded and hidden. The truth was simple and dangerous to empires. The revolution was planned at tables, not thrones. By the late 1760s, Boston was no longer simply governed by Britain. It was occupied. British redcoats did not remain at the edges of the city or inside distant forts. They lived among civilians quartered in homes, stationed near marketplaces, posted at docks and government buildings. Their presence was constant, unavoidable, and deeply personal. Boston's streets, already narrow and crowded, now felt tighter, heavier, watched. Uniforms were everywhere. Red coats brushed past workmen in alleyways. Muskets leaned against tavern walls. Bayonets flashed in candlelight. Soldiers shared space meant for families, taking rooms, food, and privacy. For Bostonians, occupation wasn't an abstract idea. It slept under the same roof. Housing tensions rose quickly. Space in Boston was scarce even before the troops arrived. Families lived tightly packed, often sharing rooms across generations. When soldiers were assigned quarters, resentment followed. Some landlords accepted payment reluctantly, others were forced. Either way, the message was clear. Civilian comfort was secondary to military control. Jobs became another battleground. Off-duty soldiers competed with dock workers and laborers for work. Redcoats took wages, locals depended on undercutting prices and inflaming anger. A sailor out of work didn't see an empire. He saw a man in uniform taking bread from his table. Every lost job felt like an act of aggression. Authority added fuel. Soldiers enforced laws civilians already hated. They guarded customs houses, accompanied tax collectors, and broke up gatherings deemed suspicious. Their very presence was a reminder that political disagreements were no longer just arguments, they were backed by force. The balance between civilian life and military power had tilted dangerously, and Boston felt it every day. Insults flew constantly. Names were exchanged in passing. A stare lasted too long. A shoulder brushed too hard. Small moments ignited tempers already stretched thin. Fights broke out in streets and taverns. Sometimes fists were enough. Sometimes weapons appeared. Each incident left scars, physical and emotional. Trust eroded. Civilians no longer felt safe speaking freely. Soldiers never felt welcome. Rumors spread quickly about informants, about punishments, about plans for crackdowns. Fear and suspicion became part of daily life. Even silence felt dangerous. Children absorbed the tension early. They learned to recognize uniforms before letters. They watched parents lower voices when soldiers passed. They learned which streets to avoid, which taverns were hostile, which corners felt safe. This generation grew up knowing conflict as atmosphere, not event. Boston became a pressure cooker. Every grievance stacks as trade, housing, jobs, was compressed into a small geographic space. There was nowhere to escape it. No distant countryside to retreat to at the end of the day. Everything happened within a few blocks, magnifying every insult and injustice. British commanders believed presence would bring order. Instead, it brought friction. The more soldiers appeared, the more resistance hardened. Civilians no longer argued abstract principles, they reacted to lived experience. Occupation transformed political disagreement into personal humiliation. Pride was wounded daily. Anger became routine. And routine anger is dangerous. Even moments of calm felt deceptive. A quiet street did not mean peace, it meant tension waiting for a spark. Everyone sensed it. Conversations ended abruptly when soldiers entered a room. Crowds formed faster. Arguments escalated quicker. The city's emotional temperature never dropped. This was not accidental. Empires rely on visibility to project control. But in Boston, visibility exposed vulnerability. Soldiers could not blend in. Every uniform reminded the city that authority came from elsewhere, enforced by men who did not belong. The conflict felt inevitable because it was built into daily life. You could not separate work from politics. You could not separate housing from power. You could not separate a walk down the street from allegiance. Boston did not choose confrontation in a single moment. It was pushed there step by step, day by day, until tension felt permanent and compromise impossible. By the time violence erupted openly, many residents felt only grim recognition, not surprise. This was what happens when control replaces consent. When authority occupies rather than governs. When a city is forced to live inside someone else's order. Boston had become unstable by design. The pressure had nowhere left to go. And pressure, once sealed tight enough, always finds release. By the spring of 1775, Boston lived inside, a feeling it could no longer name, only endure. The fear of rebellion was no longer distant or theoretical. It moved through the city like a low fog, thickening with every rumor, every patrol, every whispered conversation cut short. No one spoke openly of war, but everyone sensed its approach. The question was no longer whether violence would come, but where it would begin. British authorities felt it too. Patrols intensified. Redcoats marched later into the night, boots echoing sharply against cobblestones. Lanterns swung at their sides, casting restless shadows along walls and doorways. Sentries stood longer, watched harder. Orders were stricter, discipline tighter. The city was being held pressed down by force, in hopes that pressure might prevent explosion. It had the opposite effect. Every patrol reminded Bostonians that trust was gone. Every musket carried through the dark reinforced the truth that authority now rested on fear, not consent. The presence of soldiers after sunset felt especially intrusive. Night had once offered privacy, now it offered none. Windows glowed softly behind shutters. Candles burned later than usual. Families spoke in murmurs. Taverns closed early, not from lack of patrons, but from caution. Men lingered in doorways, watching streets instead of sleeping. Women listened for footsteps outside. Children sensed the tension even when words were withheld. Boston waited, but it did not rest. Rumors moved faster at night. Whispers passed from house to house. The British were planning arrests. Weapons were being seized. Leaders might be taken before dawn. No one knew what was true. That uncertainty was its own weapon. Across the city, messengers moved quietly. Notes were folded small. Meetings were brief. Trust was measured carefully. This was not panic, it was preparation. The city had learned patience through years of pressure, and now that patience sharpened into focus. The British command believed surprise could restore control. Orders were drafted in secrecy. Troop movements planned under cover of darkness. The aim was simple: strike quickly, remove resistance leadership, seize supplies, and prevent rebellion before it could fully form. But Boston had learned to watch. Churches, taverns, docks, every space that once spread ideas now spread awareness. The city had trained itself to notice patterns: unusual patrol routes, late-night movements, closed doors where there were usually open ones. Nothing felt accidental anymore. And above it all stood a silent witness: the Old North Church. By day, it was a place of worship. By night, it became something else, a signal point in a city that no longer trusted official channels. Its height made it visible across neighborhoods and waterways. Its stillness gave it power. What would soon shine from its tower was not just light, but confirmation. Confirmation that rumors were real. Confirmation that movement had begun. Confirmation that the waiting was over. The city held its breath. Somewhere in the dark, British soldiers prepared to move out. Somewhere else, civilians prepared to respond. Neither side slept. Both sides listened for footsteps, for signals, for the moment when tension tipped into motion. This was not chaos. It was anticipation. Boston had been shaped for this moment by years of occupation, argument, and shared grievance. The streets knew how to carry news. The people knew how to react. Resistance no longer needed instructions, it needed a trigger. The night stretched on, heavy and alert. No bells rang. No crowds gathered. No shots were fired. And yet, everything had already changed. Because a city that listens together is no longer a city under control. It is a city on the verge of action. Authority senses this too late. Power that relies on silence cannot survive awareness. As the hours crept toward dawn, Boston remained awake, not with excitement, not with celebration, but with resolve. Fear still existed, but it no longer ruled. It had been absorbed, understood, and transformed into readiness. The revolution had not announced itself. It did not need to. It waited in the streets. It waited in the windows. It waited in the spaces between footsteps. Boston didn't sleep. It listened. Boston did not set out to change the world. It set out to survive. At the beginning, it was only a British colonial town, crowded, imperfect, and dependent on an empire an ocean away. Its people worried about wages, food, shelter, and family. They argued in taverns, worked the docks, prayed in churches, and walked narrow streets worn smooth by daily routine. Nothing about Boston looked destined to ignite a global transformation, and yet, it did. Boston's transformation from colony to catalyst was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly, through pressure applied again and again. Each tax added weight. Each regulation tightened space. Each soldier narrowed the streets a little more. The city did not rebel all at once. It adapted, endured, and remembered. Pressure reshaped Boston. It turned merchants into organizers, dockworkers into witnesses, printers into amplifiers, and neighbors into networks. The city learned to speak collectively, not because it was instructed to, but because it had to. In Boston, silence became dangerous. Awareness became survival. This is what made Boston different. Other colonies felt injustice, but Boston lived inside it. Its geography compressed conflict. Its harbor magnified control. Its streets forced interaction. There was no distance between power and people, no buffer between decision and consequence. When authority acted, Boston felt it immediately at the docks, at the dinner table, in the streets outside the door. And so ordinary people were pulled into extraordinary circumstances. No single group carried the revolution alone. It was not built solely by famous names or formal assemblies. It was built by apprentices who listened before they spoke, by mothers who rationed food when the harbor closed, by sailors who carried rumors as carefully as cargo, by ministers who chose words that stirred conscience, by crowds who learned when to shout and when to wait. Boston's streets became classrooms of resistance. They taught people how power works. They taught people what occupation feels like. They taught people that authority without consent eventually relies on force, and force leaves scars. Out of this came a shift more important than any single event. Public opinion hardened. Neutrality eroded. People who once hoped compromise would restore peace began to understand that peace without justice was only quiet submission. Boston did not radicalize overnight. It was educated by experience. This is why Boston changed the world. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Honest about what pressure does to people. Honest about how long control can last when it ignores dignity. Honest about the cost of obedience demanded at gunpoint. The American Revolution did not begin as a battle plan. It began as a realization shared slowly, unevenly, but ultimately together that the existing order could not continue. Boston proved something radical and enduring, that ordinary people, living ordinary lives, could recognize when power had crossed a line, could respond without waiting for permission. The consequences were extraordinary. Ideas born in crowded rooms and narrow streets traveled far beyond the city. They crossed colonies, then oceans. They reshaped how authority was questioned, how government was justified, and how citizens understood their role within it. What happened in Boston did not stay in Boston. It echoed through history. And yet, when you strip away the monuments and textbooks, what remains is strikingly human. A city under strain. A population pushed too far. A collective decision slow, reluctant, but resolute not to remain silent. Boston reminds us that revolutions are not explosions. They are accumulations. They build in conversations. They grow in shared frustration. They mature in moments when people realize they are no longer alone in their doubts. The first shots of the American Revolution would soon be fired beyond the city. But by then, the outcome was already set in motion. Boston had done the unseen work, shaping belief, forging unity, and proving that pressure, once understood, cannot be undone. So when we look back at Boston before the revolution, we are not just seeing the past. We are seeing a pattern, a warning and a lesson. That power which refuses to listen eventually forces people to speak. That control which relies on fear creates resolve instead of obedience. That history does not turn on grand moments alone, but on countless small decisions made by ordinary people in ordinary places. As the sun sets over colonial Boston, over its harbor, its streets, its battered but unbroken spirit, we are left with a truth as relevant now as it was then. Revolutions don't begin with gunfire, they begin with pressure. And so the final question is not about Boston alone, it is about us. If you lived in Boston then, would you have stayed silent or stood up?